The German Erinnerungskultur has been quite often the subject of certain uneasiness and criticism. And I would quote the influential German researcher of historical memory, Aleida Assmann, who liked to say that the culture of memory must be self-critical and dialogical, selbstkritisch and dialogisch. And she referred to an internal discussion, but the German culture of remembrance should also be open to such a dialogue and intervention or criticism as was seen at this film presented by Eva. Assmann used to say also that memory is to some extent open. It adapts to the awareness of subsequent generations, and it poses also a challenge for them. A question may be asked here, what type of challenge is the Kremlin's war against Ukraine? What is the challenge, for example, for our city, the city of Berlin, for the landscape of monuments in Berlin? And this war is fought using the same symbolic resources as are seen partly on the huge monuments in Tiergarten or Treptow. And German students of memory, not only Aleida Assmann, like to say also that memory should be diverse and inclusive. Another question follows in this respect. Who is not present or who is not included in these monuments in monumental landscape of Berlin? Are, for example, Ukrainians present enough under the umbrella of Soviets, which is this umbrella now highly instrumentalized by Russia? Are, another example, are Poles enough included both as victims and the allies? The focus of these monuments, of this landscape of monuments is, for example, on the end of the war. And is the beginning of the war, the 1st September 1939 included? Is the first phase of the war where German Third Reich cooperated with Soviet Union, so in years 1939, 1941, enough visible in this memory landscape? I'm asking now these questions because in the story of the Second World War monuments in Berlin is not only about aesthetics, not only about the historical accuracy, historical facts, but also about our understanding of the current war in Ukraine. The aforementioned facts include the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the deliberate attempt to exterminate local national elites and its culture by mass deportations to Siberia, for example. Far from being a long forgotten thing of the distant past, they are actually closer to serving as a blueprint for Russia's war against Ukraine. And this is the reason why we organize together with Vitsche organizations, so with organizations of Ukrainian diaspora, this discussion series.
Thank you. And I will start with the first question to Yuliya Yurchuk. And the question will be how you can describe the memory politics and the memorials about the role of the Ukraine in the Second World War in the world.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I think this is a very important series which you are doing, and I'm not a specialist on the German case, so my comments will be mainly as a historian of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. But what you are talking about, it's extremely interesting for me, and especially everything what is going on in memory politics. As historian, I will start with history and tell something like some facts about Ukrainian participation in the war, and then we will concentrate more on the memory. Historian George Lieber wrote, "The Second World War ignited a monstrous, all-encompassing inferno, a conflagration without end and mercy." And indeed, for Ukraine, the Second World War, which started for many Ukrainians with Soviet occupation in the West, and then from 1941 continued with Nazi occupation of the whole territory, became the most traumatic period, with extensive physical destructions, enormous demographic losses, which allowed Timothy Snyder to speak about Ukraine as epicenter of what he calls bloodlands. And Ukraine became also a center of what is now called the Holocaust by bullets. And the Nazi occupation for Ukrainians and for people of all nationalities which were living in Ukraine at that time meant imprisonment, mass shootings, concentration camps, ghettos, forced labor, starvation, torture, and like from different people in different scales, but it was the time of major suffering. About 1.5 million Jews were killed on the territory of Ukraine, and some 2.2 million people were taken from Ukraine to Germany as slave laborers, as you know, Ostarbeiter, or Eastern workers. Ukraine's human and material losses during the Second World War were enormous. It's different estimates, but between 5 to 7 million people in Ukraine perished during the Second World War. And the material losses are estimated as about 40% of Ukraine's national wealth. So it was what the Second World War meant for Ukrainians as victims. And about 4.5 million Ukrainians were fighting in the ranks of the Soviet army during the Second World War. So 4.5 million people were from Ukraine in the Soviet army. And then we come a little bit to memory, because after the war, directly after the war, more than 2.5 million of Ukrainians were awarded Soviet and Western medals or other kinds of distinctions. So enormous number of people. And more than 2,000 became the heroes of the Soviet Union. And some of these people were recognized as heroes of the Soviet Union twice, and one Ukrainian, the pilot Ivan Kozhedub, was awarded this order of hero of the Soviet Union three times. So we can see that after the war, the Soviet authorities recognized the input of Ukrainian population, Ukrainians in the victory. Ukrainians were not only a part of the Soviet army, also many ethnic Ukrainians were in the armies of allies in Canada, in USA, in Great Britain. About 100,000 were the soldiers of Ukrainian insurgent army, and about 80,000 were in the service of the division SS Galicia. So it's about the numbers who were, like how many Ukrainians were in what kinds of armies. And now about the memory. There was no memory of Holocaust as such in the Soviet Union. The Soviet people collectively were presented as winners over Nazi Germany and the victims. The master narrative of war in the Soviet Union was mainly the narrative of triumph. And this was exactly the triumph of victory over Nazism, which in the Soviet Union was called fascism. So maybe even now when you listen to Russians or even Putin, they speak a lot about fascism and they mean Nazism. So it's a kind of long story. And the war also in the Soviet Union was called the Great Patriotic War, as you know, and it started in this triumphal narrative of war in 1941 and ended on the 9th of May 1945. So you already mentioned it, and we already see it that there are some discrepancies, right, on when we speak about the Western memory of war and the Soviet one. And this Soviet narrative, it's pretty much still alive and used in Russia. But what is interesting that this triumph is even more exaggerated. So this kind of exaggeration of victory without any reflection over the price of victory is reaching the scale of this victory frenzy, where the cult of violence and even pretty much rapist culture is in the center of this very strange, I would say, the victory frenzy. It's like this obsession with victory. And I must say that during the Soviet Union, this triumphal narrative of the war functioned as a fundamental myth in the Soviet Union, because the Second World War was indeed the biggest historical experience shared by all the people in the Soviet republics. Almost, and in Ukraine as well, almost each Ukrainian family lost someone in the Second World War. It was the Victory Day was indeed a great day for many families when they visited the graves of their relatives and took part in parades and so on. And everything started to shift with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it was the time when this kind of the price of victory became challenged and questioned. And here I won't speak about all the republics and how they challenge this great victory, but maybe the most important thing is to say that some historical topics which were silenced by the Soviet narrative of war, like Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they became known to the public. And people started questioning this period, why we are talking about Great Patriotic War, why we are talking about 1941, 1945, what was happening to Ukraine during 1939 and 1941. So this is kind of questions which arise during this first years of 90s. And during this time, exactly, we can see in Ukraine pretty much the diversification of memories. And this is the time when these taboo topics, and it also included this very sensitive and questionable topics of heroic struggle against the Soviets by the Ukrainian insurgent army. They were made into kind of new heroes especially in the western regions of Ukraine, without actually asking ourselves what kind of heroes they were, what kind of activities they had, and the only thing what was underlined was this anti-Soviet struggle of the Ukrainian insurgent army. And mainly what is relevant to say for all the Ukraine is that this memory of triumph became questioned, and the narrative of war became more complex. And even during the first years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the similar process was in Russia. But towards the beginning of 2000s, when Putin came to power, this kind of movement to questioning the price of victory, and some attempts to create some new narrative of war, it just disappeared. And as you know, Memorial was very active in Russia in speaking about the Soviet crimes. But with the beginning of 2000 and especially 2010 and later on, it was very much a lot of pressure on all these actors who were questioning this triumphal narrative. And also, you know that now it's even not possible for Memorial to work in Russia. So it's a foreign agent, as it is labeled. But in Ukraine, this work on re-evaluation, reinterpreting, reworking of the memory of the Second World War as it was present in the Soviet Union was in constant making. So it was a really huge process from 90s to 2022. Yeah, maybe we will speak more about it, but it's like very shortly. I'm sorry if it is too long.
Quite difficult and like large topic to discuss. That's why it's quite normal. Yeah, I will say that how we see the dictatorship and how it was in the Soviet Union, this type of the generalization in the language, even we have a lot of also research and programs which are discovered like how they works with the language, and that's why, for example, we can also discuss why they was naming this in the like why they was naming this but as the fascism, not the Nazism, and it also has a lot of background. That's why we have again this generalization in this point and the definition of the triumph and everything, and also that in this kind of the generalization we losing the quite important parts of the history and also about the Second World War, I will say, and forgetting about like in their culture of memory. Forgetting, for example, for the years like 1939 and 1941, and forgetting about the pact. And for example, as this Soviet War Memorial, which we see in the video, basically has also the years of the war, 1941, 1945. And about this, we will turn around our focus to the Berlin. And I would like to ask you, Niko Rollmann, about the historian and the political background of the Soviet memorials precisely in Berlin.
Okay, better. Thank you. I would first of all like to thank you, Eva, for giving me the opportunity to be here, and also my thanks goes to the Pilecki-Institut for hosting the event. Now, earlier on, as I was making some notes on these monuments, I think there were a lot of aspects which you had already asked in advance, and I think that these three big monuments have a relatively complex history. And perhaps first of all, to start from the inside, as you will know, the Red Army, as it advanced across Eastern Europe, then especially in 1944 and 1945, left, if you want to call it like that, a trail of memorials, which normally had what you might call a twin function. So first of all, as a sign of victory, of a certain dominance, using a kind of Soviet Stalinist choreography, but also at the same time, of course, often in a connection with the mass graves for Soviet soldiers. And we saw with a lot of interest here in Germany that in countries like Poland, some time ago, they started to demolish or reduce some of these monuments, that in some cases the Red Star had suddenly gone, or that they were, as far as I know, demolished altogether, because for the Eastern Europeans this was perhaps also a moment of liberation, symbolically speaking, finally getting rid of the Soviet legacy, especially in the context that you had a new aggressive Russia as it emerged under Putin. Now, as we all know, the war ends in Berlin in May 45, at least the European part of the war, and the Soviets subsequently constructed these three huge monuments, and I think they have obviously a number of different meanings. And so there again, we are talking about the symbols of victory, of Stalinism, of sacrifice, and in each case being surrounded by the graves of thousands of people, as I said earlier on. Now, I would also like to point out at the same time that there is a huge difference in perception here in Germany if you compare it, for example, to the perception you would have in countries like Poland. And that is, of course, that for us in our collective memory, it all starts with 1941 when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, which was one of the biggest disasters of the 20th century. So I remember that when I was a young boy at school in a West German school, there was always this number which came up, which was that the Soviet Union had lost 25 million people as a result of the Nazi onslaught. Nowadays, the number is estimated, as far as I know, to be actually 27 million. So I would say that the average educated German has got a certain feeling of guilt about this. And this is something especially with my generation, I'm 51 now, and which also came up in debates about the war in the Ukraine. So that for some of my friends or the people who are close to me, the idea of Germany giving weapons to a country, weapons which will then be used to kill Russian soldiers, that is in a way unthinkable because it breaks certain taboos. Or to give you another example, maybe some 7 or 8 years ago, NATO stationed a few hundred soldiers in the Baltic states. This was long before the war in the Ukraine, and I remember someone saying, well, the Americans or NATO are doing a certain amount of war mongering, and this is impossible that again close to the borders of Russia, you know, the West is stationing troops, which in a way flabbergasted me because, well, what about the Eastern Europeans? You know, what about the Baltic states as victims of Soviet and fascist aggression? What about countries like Poland and so on? And there we have a first problem also with the relations to the Soviet memorials. And you mentioned this earlier on, that in Germany we had after a while simply replaced the word Soviet with the Russian. But it's obviously not the same, because as soon as you talk about Russia, then what about countries like Ukraine? What about the Baltic, the other Eastern European states? So you can see that there is a certain lack of symmetry. And perhaps, I don't want to go on for too long, but I would like to point out another speciality, which is different than, for example, if you compare it to the Soviet war memorials in other states. And that is in a way that we as Germany gave a promise to the Soviet Union as it existed still then in 1990, when you had the negotiations for a possible German reunification, the so-called 2+4 or 4+2 talks, where we said, okay, you give us the reunification, and in return we give you certain promises, we give you financial aid, and we promise not to touch these Soviet memorials, because we know that we as Germans have imposed terrible suffering on the people of the Soviet Union. So to cut a long story short, I think that for many, many Germans here, these monuments, despite all of their problematic symbolisms, and despite the fact that now for you they must be a huge provocation, are perceived in a way as being untouchable. And so I cannot give you a proper full answer as what to do. Maybe we come back later on, but I think that these are really important points to make from a German perspective.
Okay, I will use this microphone. And it's quite important what you mentioned, this 2+4 Vertrag, and it's quite important to speak about this and also about the politics of the memorial right now from the Senate and how the city of Berlin working with this from this architectural perspective and the cultural perspective, because right now we can also see how the Soviet became to be as the synonym for the Russian in this case. And this question about this 2+4 Vertrag, I would like to ask you, Christoph, Rauhut, to describe us a little bit more about how it worked and how it works right now.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation and pursuing this very important discussion. And you have asked me to speak as the state conservator of Berlin, and in that role I should differentiate your question a bit, because if we look very closely at the Ehrenmale monuments of in Berlin, the Soviet Ehrenmale, we see that they actually have two layers of illegal protection status, and one is the 2+4 Verträge, as you mentioned, which is a document signed by the Federal Republic of Germany, and taking over the task. And the second one is that they are all also legal protected monuments by the monument law of Berlin. And my main task is obviously to represent the second layer. And I think, but it's also interesting to discuss that in relation maybe to the first layer of protection. And why are they protected monuments of the city of Berlin? Because they have a very important historic relevance. And I think that is what you have also tried to describe, and one could also go further into the different monuments and try to describe this, their different roles, their different aspects. For example, the one here close to Tiergarten, or in the Tiergarten, being the most, well, with the tanks, the one which is focusing mostly on the war itself, and on the tanks entering Berlin. We know those are not the ones which are probably the first ones, but obviously Hitler was very close in his bunker when those tanks and the Soviet army entered Berlin. And from my perspective, the historic layer of this monument, or one of the very important monument layers of this monument, is that it is focusing on the war, and the one in Schönholzer Heide is, for example, very much focused on the individual remembrance of soldiers being killed. And I think so there is already a landscape of remembrance within those monuments, and this landscape is obviously historic. They were created at a point in time, and they fulfilled the historic perception at that time. And I think that's the starting point for us now to look at those monuments again and discuss how we deal with them. But I think we agree that they have a very high level of, as I would say, protection status as historic monuments, but also in Germany becoming reunificated, because they were part of this 2+4 Verträge, and that all these levels which are within those monuments, in some way they're for sure also what we call uncomfortable heritage. And I think that's a very important term in Germany, since we have a lot of uncomfortable heritage from different dictatorships, different forms of totalitarism, if we look closer, I would say that we haven't the discussion about uncomfortable heritage was very much focused on the monuments and the buildings of Nazi Germany and also of the GDR, but the discussion is becoming broader at the moment, and it's a very good sign. And I very much agree that the landscape of remembrance has to evolve. It's an evolving landscape, since society and history is evolving. But at the same time, I would always argue that history has to play a very important role in that landscape, and in a way, it has to be the starting point of many discussions we have.
Maybe one small question. So, what was your personal first reaction after you watched the film of Eva?
No, I think this is a form of engaging with heritage, and I mean, the question is it art? Is it a form of remembrance? Is it a form of criticism? But it's an engagement with a monument, and it's a form of dealing with history and the relicts of history. So I very much support such movies, actions, and the discussion about those monuments. At the same time, as a conservative, as a conservationist, I would always say it is good that we have those monuments as a starting point, and that's why we shouldn't take them away, because if they're taken away, we cannot have such a movie again. Then the story is told, and so let's rather have lots of movies like this instead of one action, because we also know that this one action will get historicized and that's not a continuous and evolving form of remembrance.
Just to mention that it's not a movie by Eva, it's a movie by Pilecki-Institut and Vitsche, because he was involved, and it was incredible part of this even idea. I would say that I'm totally agree that it's kind of the inspiration, but I do hope that it will be kind of inspiration, not just for the inspiration, but also for some reaction or action. And also one more action which we can get from this even Soviet memorial context, and when we are speaking about this 2+4 track, we also speaking about subjectivity of the whole participant in this this topic. And right now I'm speaking also from the point of the Ukraine as the subject, because when we are thinking about the Ukraine, like in some while ago, we are speaking about all the time that the Ukraine was kind of the object in some discussion, and it's the problem when we are in the time of the post-colonial discourse. But right now we are seeing Ukraine in the decolonization discourse, and it's quite important because the Ukraine become the own strong voice, which should be heard, which should be also supported, I will say. And when we are going further with this, I would like to ask Yuliya Yurchuk about this exact decolonization perspective of the Soviet War Memorial.
Usually when I start speaking about what was going on in Ukraine from this decolonization perspective, I used to draw parallels to what was happening just several years ago in the USA about the monuments to the Confederacy, because I think it really is more a kind of telling to the Western public what is going on then. At least my students understand me better when I first start speaking about these monuments in the US and this movement against these monuments. And then this kind of revisions of Soviet past and Soviet heritage in Ukraine. I think that you all understand what I'm speaking about. So that in 2017 there was a huge movement in the US against the monuments to Confederacy, and especially a tragic event happened in Charlottesville when one woman was killed by a person who is adherent to neo-Nazi ideology. And this event pretty much reflects the shifts in the attitudes about race and reconciliation in the American society. And I remember very well that it was a huge reaction even in Sweden when the students demanded to rename the rooms or streets on the campuses, or demolish the monuments on the campuses which are dedicated to the people, to professors who in the beginning of the 20th century developed the racist theories. So when I start speaking about all these events, then suddenly my students start to understand how Ukrainians might feel when they see some monuments from, or some heritage from the Soviet past, and maybe they also feel kind of this humiliation which is felt by some Americans or some Swedes when they see these kind of monuments to the people who adhere to racist theories, or who were the supporters or approved slavery. So then it becomes, I think, more understandable how not only Ukrainians, because this kind of movements against the Soviet heritage or these movements against Soviet monuments, they were in the Baltic states as well. So it's not only some kind of Ukrainian and very marginal history or story. It's very much what was going on through the 90s in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, and many countries which belong to this socialist bloc. And in Ukraine, very often people speak about decommunization, but I would say that this decommunization process, it's very much a part of this kind of decolonization process, where Ukraine or Ukrainians start inventing a new story about themselves, where they and their experiences are in the center. And it's not like the center in Moscow who tells their story, it's their own story told from inside, like from Ukraine, where Ukraine is the center. So it is pretty much this decentering of the narrative, decentering of the historical narrative. And this process didn't start in 2022. It didn't start even in 2014 or 15 when these laws on decommunization were adopted in Ukraine. Everything started really in the very beginning of the 90s, when Ukraine, similar to other states, many other states, started to distance itself from this Soviet master narrative. And this process was kind of had a different different conditions and different consequences. Because on the one hand, I already mentioned this kind of establishing new national history and new national themes in history, but it was also questioning of Ukrainian own role in all the processes of the Soviet history. And I think this is something what is really interesting to see how Ukraine visited its history in terms of the Soviet past. What was the role of Ukraine in this Soviet past? It's also, I think, important part of this decolonization efforts. And also what is very often meant by this decommunization narratives, especially after 2014, it was this focus or emphasis on reconciliation. So what was meant to be reconciled was exactly this kind of Soviet experience, and these more silenced experiences of some groups, like, for instance, these nationalist groups, which were active during the Second World War, for instance. How to reconcile this narrative of the Soviet victory and this narrative of the anti-Soviet struggle. So it was pretty much this work after 2014. And I just want to finish this by saying that very often when we speak about monuments, especially the totalitarian monuments, we kind of project our experience of how monuments are built in the democratic society, right? That there is some open discussion, and at the end of the open discussion, there is the monument built. But it was not the case in the totalitarian society. It was pretty much this movement from above, and there was not the discussion, do we need in this village or in this city the monument to the Soviet soldiers again and again and again. So this is something what is very much, I think, neglected when we discuss monuments. And when we now speak about this kind of reinterpretation, reinvention, revisiting, it's already done in the more open society, and it's already done in the society which is going, which was from the 90s going to this democratization aim, or like the main target was democracy, right? And it was totally different circumstances. So it was already much a lot of discussions. It was not the totalitarian regime, right? And that is very often neglected, just to reflect that we are projecting the same kind of openness to the past where it was not open at all. So that maybe we don't need some monuments which were just imposed without any kind of public discussion and public responses. And I studied, for instance, these memories of this nationalist movements. And during the war was going on, the people on the nationalist side were killed, and directly the people, the local people, were building the monuments to them. It was during the 40s, like 43, for instance, right? 44. And the Soviets directly demolished these monuments. So, and it also shows a lot of these tensions, that it was not always kind of acceptance of the only writer's narrative of war, which was Soviet. It was much more complicated and much more like this imposing of the monuments, not this open building of the monuments.
I also know that in Berlin, it was also this discussion about the personality which was supporting the racism, or the name of the streets or the U-Bahn station. It should be also named because they show this, they present also personality who were, or the words which presented the racist definition or something like that. Maybe I'm not right, so maybe you can give a little bit more.
That's right. In Berlin is an ongoing discussion about the colonial past, which can be found in buildings and street names and monuments, and also on the military past of Germany, not only during the Nazi regime. I think it's important that we differentiate the different functions of, I would say, monuments, street names, maybe buildings that have been used by, or have been built by totalitarian systems for specific purposes, and by that define also ways of how to deal with those different objects, because I mean, naming a street is obviously has a function of heroizing someone and giving making someone more important, or it could be done as a form of remembrance. Monuments are very similar, but for example, with the Ehrenmale, as we call them in German here in Berlin, it's already not that easy, because as we heard, they have also been places where people have been buried. So there are different layers within them. And if we go to buildings, it usually gets a lot more complicated because they have a history of use. And actually this history of use and this layering is probably the best concept of dealing with such heritage. So always adding new layers of use. And this is something we can we can do with a building, even though it was constructed maybe during the GDR or the Nazi regime. But it does get more complicated once we go back to monuments or to street names, because with a street name, it's almost impossible to have two street names. We can only have the former one and the new one, but something like this is possible, and it's very important that we, I think, have those discussions. And Berlin is having this discussion right now. There was a very interesting study of how many names, street names in Berlin, can be related to colonial contexts or National Socialist contexts, or even anti-Semitic contexts.
Let's change our focus to the country who are already doing this for a long time. And I would like to ask Aleksandra Sumorok, how has changed the optics in Poland after the 1989 about the Soviet architecture?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the possibility to take part in this discussion. I was really interested in what you were talking about, and I agree with a lot of points, especially maybe with this, that the architecture, maybe not architecture, you were talking about monuments, but also the buildings may stay the monument, create the landscape of remembrance, which is changing during the time. And how the optic changed, for sure it changed a lot. However, not exactly. The 1989 was the turning point in this perception shift toward Stalinist architecture in Poland or socialist realism architecture in Poland. At first it was unwanted, condemned heritage. Then it was complicated, uncomfortable, as it was said here. And today it is mostly seen as a just heritage, historical heritage. Especially it differs by generation, and the attitude toward the socialist realist monuments differs because of these backgrounds or generations, because old generation and young generation look at this quite differently. There were, in fact, shifts in thinking about the heritage and visible. The first one was obvious, 1956, the fall, and the socialist realism, monuments, architecture, in fact, was totally seen as bad, and it was condemned. The shift toward modernism was done then. And the first trial to reinterpret, to the reinterpretation of Stalinist architecture was made in the 70s and 80s. Some master theses, important one, and some doctoral theses, books were written on socialist realism architecture and art, which changed the perspective on socialist realism. And another interest, another wave of interest about Stalinist architecture and the debate started at the turn of the century, at the beginning of 21st century. It was mainly connected with the problem of preservation. And it started from the conservators, because after 50 years, the problem of changing buildings, the problem of evaluation appeared, the problem of disappearing, and the problem what to do with the not only monuments, because it is not only the Palace of Science and Culture, Marszałkowska housing estate, but also a lot of other buildings worth considering in terms of forms also. Nowadays, I think this attitude, because I'm not talking about this research perspective, but attitude has changed, and people in general, especially young, rather appreciated, or if not appreciated, they feel that this is historical heritage. I talk today, especially with my students, the future designers and artists, of course, and I ask them about socialist realism architecture. And it is distant past for them. It is unknown heritage, not only uncomfortable heritage, but mainly unknown heritage. And if they can name the buildings, that monuments that were constructed, it is of course the Palace of Science, of Culture and Science, which is very specific example of the monument and architecture, because in fact it is not Poland, it is the only one not Polish building constructed in Poland at this time. But these young people had no doubts that that this building should be protected, that this is part of our history, and it should be protected, not changed. Also, not only the attitude toward the buildings of the people has changed, but also, of course, scientific narratives changed. I won't talk about all the narratives, how they changed, but we can say about three dominating tendencies in writing about monuments architecture. The first one is focusing on political and ideological factors. This is the narration of rejection, in fact, and it was dominated in this first period of researching socialist realism. The second one is focusing on the style, form, and is examining, judging the socialist realist architecture in the terms of form. It is very useful and needed, of course, in preservation and in assessing, evaluating the historic and artistic values of these buildings. And the third one is more contemporary one, and is treating socialist realist architecture, buildings, monuments, more complex way, in more contextual context, is placing it in more contextual context, is taking into account the differences, architects and other actors. It's treating it not as a monolith, and is trying to put socialist realist architecture in the broader context of post-war architecture and, for example, modernization process as a part also of the modernization process. It doesn't mean that this perspective abandoned the political narratives or ideology, but it wants to create more complex view of the very complex style that involved a lot of people, not only the simple relation and opposition, state architect, state people, but also a lot of different factors were involved there. It was not only architecture made, maybe if I would put it the other way, the architecture of this time was made, and it is visible and seen this by architects. It was imposed, but it was realized by certain people, modernists in fact, that were subjected to modern tradition and were tried to also make it under these circumstances as individual, as their own as possible. And for sure, when we compare the architecture in DDR or in Poland, it is different. When we see Karl Marx Allee, when we compare how Marszałkowska housing estate, it is similar because the idea is similar, but in fact it is very different. Differs also new cities subjected to the similar ideas, but having different backgrounds. Eisenhüttenstadt, Nowa Huta, or Dunawi Varoshi in Hungary. So for today, I think we just try to treat it as a more complex phenomena, not only as some kind of aberration, only ideological. Of course, we are not abandoned these perspectives, but try to make it not so monolithic.
Basically, we can see how it started with the like the building when they was put it from the this totalitarian regime. This first was when the people and society become to be free from this totalitarian regime. There was first naming this built in the context of the triumph and victory, this generalization and monumentalization. And after that, when the complex become to be like clearly seen that it's the part of the totalitarian regime, it's become to be also more deeply in the context. What does it mean? Who was in? And the form and everything was described after that. So firstly, the Soviet Union become to the heritage of the Soviet Union, and the totalitarian regime first was named as the heritage of the totalitarismus, kind of that. Has I understood right? And after that become to be this discussion which you described right now.
The discussion between yes, the beginning of these perspectives were and judging this architecture starts in the Soviet time, I mean the communist time. And right now, after, of course, the transition, the different perspectives appears. However, they were subjected to other factors, not only politics, generation gap, new historians, and the distance that we had towards this architecture.
Then let's go further to the Berlin again, and I would like to ask Niko Rollmann about how has changed the acceptance of the Soviet War Memorial in Berlin after 1989, and I would like to focus on the Panzerdenkmal Kleinmachau.
Yes, I would say that this is perhaps a special case. It is a monument which has got a somewhat turbulent history, originally being located in the west of Berlin, in Zehlendorf, which would have been the American sector. And there it was frequently vandalized. So it had paint thrown at it or slogans painted onto it, normally referring to Soviet crimes. The result being that essentially then the Americans constructed a cage around it. And so there are some very interesting photos from the time where you see a Soviet tank essentially with a cage around it, until it was then subsequently relocated. Actually, it was relocated twice, so in 1955 and 1969, and so with the relocations, it was finally on what you might call East German or Soviet territory. And so it was not at risk from vandalism anymore. And then, of course, well, not of course, but then there was an interesting sequence of events in the wake of the collapse of communism, essentially with the tank, first of all, being removed, and then the whole construction being replaced by an artist called Eckhard Heisch in 1992 with a snow plow, essentially, which one might interpret as a kind of hidden reference, or well, perhaps not too hidden, but to the East German opposition movement, which had the slogan, which as far as I know is essentially a biblical slogan, that swords should be turned into plows, or in this case a snow plow, and then finally the whole thing also attaining the status of a listed monument. I think this was in 1993, but I mean, this is an example that has often been remarked upon as being a very creative way of dealing with the Soviet memorials, typical tank memorials, which people find offensive. But I would like to make the point that it's not really a kind of typical way of dealing with it in Germany. And although it is by all means remarkable, I think it's rather an exception than the rule. And I think in most cases, I would say that people like the idea of keeping these monuments intact. And of course, you have got sometimes these unofficial voices which say, oh, let's tear it down, or now in the wake of the attack on the Ukraine, we should get rid of all of these Soviet monuments. But the official voices, at least, and I think this has also come across with the two of us, Christoph and I, that we think they should essentially stay as they are. And at the same time, I would just perhaps like to add one little layer. I think this was also very important what Christoph said about these different layers of memory, and also making the whole topic more complicated of how we deal with such monuments. And beyond that, there are also more hidden layers if you differentiate between East and West Germans, especially with reference to the Soviet Union and its monuments. And the most common example, which is also often quoted in the literature, is the following. If you ask what traumatic experience did Germans have during the Second World War, then there would be two things coming up. First of all, the bombing raids on the cities, and then the massive sexualized assaults on women in 1945 by the Soviet forces. Now, in the west of Germany, in post-war Germany, there would not be too much talk about the bombing raids by the Americans or British. So I, for example, come from Hamburg, which was essentially pulverized in 1943 by bombing raids. But this was not a big topic. You would not talk about it much because now the Americans and the British were our friends and we did not want to offend them. So you would not read so much about that in the official newspapers, but rather your grandparents telling you about, the bombing raids on Hamburg after they had a few glasses of wine or what have you, while at the same time, it was extensively in the public literature about the war. The topic was all the Soviets raping the women in 1945. Whereas in East Germany, it was the other way around. There was essentially no reference whatsoever to any of the sexualized violence of the Soviet troops, while there was an extensive coverage of the bombing raids of the Americans and the British, because now in the Cold War, they were the enemies. And especially disturbing was the fact that in some cases, the East German authorities, when they referred to these bombing raids, actually used the same language as the Nazis had by using the specific word Terrorangriffe for these air raids, which was Nazi vocabulary. And I think if you look at the Soviet memorials now, as they are just a few hundred meters away as it is from us, I think this is another dimension. If you look at the suffering of women, during the war, especially in the Second World War, because most of the monuments were made by men or were conceptualized by men, and the collective traumatization of women has essentially not been yet a subject in any of the monument language of the Second World War, if you wish. So I think that there is another huge void, and if you want to, you can draw parallels to the topic of the so-called comfort women in Asia, who were essentially sex slaves for the Japanese army, and perhaps the little cruel joke of history being that now in Berlin we have got what you might call an official monument, which was constructed some time ago, I think by an NGO, referring to the suffering of the so-called comfort women. So here we have another extra layer of meaning, in fact.
Then I would like to ask also almost the same question, but with a small change. How has changed the culture and the memorial politic by the Senate from the 1989, or maybe it has not changed?
It's a difficult question, actually, and I should maybe answer also in different ways. I think first of all, you have to see that there is an ongoing discussion about the Berlin as a landscape of remembrance and memorial. And this is not only the Senate, but it's also obviously also the federal state of Germany. And I find it, for example, important to point out that in very close proximity of the Tiergarten Ehrenmal, the remembrance place for the Holocaust was built, the remembrance place for the Sinti and Roma killed during the Third Reich, and the remembrance place for the gay people. And so I think the landscape of remembrance is evolving. We're in a process, and as we speak, we can read in the newspapers now that there's an ongoing discussion about do we need another place of remembrance for the Second World War and what happened all over Europe, and also there's an ongoing discussion about should we have a place for remembrance for the people who died due to communism. And it is, for example, also, I think, important to point out that the list of listed buildings and monuments is still evolving, even with places from the Nazi regime. So within the last years, we have had a focus on places where forced labor took place, forced labor for soldiers being imprisoned, but also forced labor by other groups. And we are still adding to our list of places, and I think that's what has happened over the last decades, and the focus is always kind of shifting. The focus on forced labor during the Third Reich is more a recent one, which has been there for the last 15 years. Probably we celebrated the documentation center and the founding of it. I think it was 10 years or 11 years now in last year, so the 10-year anniversary, which was built in Schöneweide. And so the landscape of remembrance, the landscape of monuments is becoming more and more complex, and the difficulty, and I think that's what was very well pointed out, is that the audience and the actors we kind of educate and or perceive those monuments is getting wider. We have the generations which see them as historic places. We have the older generations. We are a migrant society, so we have people coming from different cultural contexts, and they obviously see something very different. And you can tell that both of us obviously grew up in, for example, in West Germany, and we have the East German perspective, and that is what is maybe what has happened over the last decades, is that we have always been adjusting to those new contexts. But we can also ask ourselves, have we fully adjusted to what is necessary in a political view, and also in terms of the historic precision? And I think historic precision is very important at the very moment we start to historize certain objects. And it was pointed out in the beginning that we tend to speak of Russians and Soviets in the same way, and what is maybe one of the very important results of our discussion at the moment, that we have to be more complex, and that we have to allow our discussion to be more complex. And I find it, for example, very interesting that those Ehrenmale were part of the 2+4 Verträge, but there's also I think in 1997 or 8 is a contract between the state of Ukraine and Germany, in which the places of buried soldiers are discussed, and the taking care of war graves, sorry, of war graves, but the Ehrenmale are not mentioned in this contract at all. They're not in the contract, and that is obviously a sign that at that time there was no political, no social precision and attendance of that theme.
So I would say distinction between cemetery and monument. Is this visible in German debates? Because, for example, in Poland, there is, I think, the consensus that it was possible, for example, in Warsaw to demolish the monument. So in the street of Warsaw, a monument devoted to Soviet soldiers. But it was agreement and consensus that cemetery in the other part of Warsaw, so with also the big monument of Soviet soldiers, will be there. I mean, but there's a distinction between cemetery is something, war cemetery is something which we care of, but the only monument is the symbol of Soviet dominance, and we can, in a way, demolish it. And this is such a kind of distinction. I think I don't know. So if Aleksandra agree with me, but I think is quite important distinction in Polish debate. And my question is there any similar possibility for German debate to distinguish between okay, we care about Soviet graves of soldiers, but we also think able to move the monuments of Soviet imperialism, something like that. So is this way of thinking possible in German or not?
Yes, there's a difference, and as you can tell, I'm always looking for the right English word, because in German it's very precise, the difference between those different places. But I think you're also asking, is there a difference in not only in language-wise, but also in how to deal, or how we're dealing with those places? And maybe the short answer is, in the end, the result is very similar. As we protect both of them, and we put a historic relevance to both places, to both kinds. But obviously, the discussion is obviously very different. I mean, I would very differently speak about a graveyard than about a monument of honor or of remembrance. But some arguments are the same, and so it's. I wouldn't say that we have a very distinct differentiation, but there is one.
Then I would like to continue about the historical relevance. I think it's quite important, and when we also speaking about the landscape in the city, we need also to remember that it's all the time changing by the events which are happening right now in the world, and that's why we have, for example, the discussion about the colonial monuments who are like the person who is supporting Rasim's conception on, and so on and so on. And I remember that I was quite impressed that, for example, in the zoo, it exists the monuments of the, like it's the monuments of the director in the zoologische, at the Zoologische Garden Station. And for example, near the one of the director, it's the Denkmaltafel, or how it's called, with the like prescription that this director has supported the Nazi regime. And then we see this historian relevance, and we see that, for example, these monuments we still have here in the landscape, but we were thinking this because the event changed, the regime changed, and we named the totalitarian regime the totalitarian regime. And in this case, it's quite strange, I will say right now, that after all what happened and after all was had changed in 1989, we still don't have such a thing as the Denkmaltafel. Why, for example, in the Soviet War Memorial, we have the year 1941, 1945. So by some people, it could be seems like the war started for the Germany or for the Berlin in 1941, but it's quite not true. And it's quite important to think about this conception also when we are thinking about the Poland or the West Ukraine, which was in this time in the war already. So the basically question.
I think every building, every monument is a result of its time and of its creator, or its creators. And what you're saying is very important, that we should not perceive them as right or as given, and that they need to be contextualized. And this is an ongoing task. And we had a very interesting discussion about the site of the Olympic Games here in Berlin, 1936, which is still there existing, and also the art which was put at that site, the sculptures are still existing. And last year, I think 2 years ago, there was a public discussion about, is it right to have this sculptures still on the other side, and is the contextualization still valid? And we started to look at what was done almost, I think it was in 2004, so it's 15, almost 20 years ago, and it was very interesting to see that they, at that time, they focused obviously on certain parts of the site, because I thought those were the important parts, and the contextualization was very good. But they also didn't look at certain areas because they were not that important at the time in terms of function. There were no visitors, and that changed in the last years. So what we learned is that we have to contextualize such heritage, but we have to redo it all the time, and we have to invent new forms. We have to adapt to the new audiences, as I said, and we have to take into account all the new knowledge we gain.
Maybe one question related to this contextualization, because I think the problem I can see, so also in Warsaw, for example, so Aleksandra told us that attitude to Soviet architecture, not monument but architecture, so it has changed, and I agree. I have no problem with, for example, with housing architecture from this time. But the problem I see is that, for example, in Warsaw, the famous example of Palace of Culture, so the modeled after the similar buildings in Moscow. But this is the very broad building using space in the area as a context. I mean that the planners put it as a context for this monumental architecture, monumental monuments. And my question is, so do you agree that we can shorten the space? I mean, to change the context, not by demolishing the very building or demolishing the very monument, but simply to use the space for people, not in the sense the Soviet planners planned it at the very originally at the beginning. Because I think this context, the change of this context could change something. I think, for example, so my personal opinion is that we should leave the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, but to cut their legs. I mean, to make this building in horizontal and not in vertical position. And I think, okay, so maybe this is too provocative for people coping with SU. So there's a corporate, but you know what I mean. So for me, it's thinkable.
The Palace of Culture in Warsaw is probably is a very good case in terms of how much space does a building need, because there's I don't know any building that needs more space around it. No building which was designed with more space around it, which should stay empty. I mean, that was the very clear idea of the planners at the time. And I would like to answer in two ways. I think we should have this discussion about, do we need the space or not? And one can have it in two different ways. One could say, okay, we are taking something away from the building and taking some space from the building away, or we are turning it around and saying we are giving something more to the context of the building, which is of the same or of even higher importance. And I think that's what is happening, as I remember in Warsaw right now, is that there's the construction of a museum in very close proximity. And I think it's a good way to deal with it, because you are giving something more to society, you're giving something more to the public, and by that it's kind of that what we in German and in the heritage sector say is when we level out different Belange and look for the higher importance of certain issues. And in that case, a museum, I would say, is something which adds to the city, it adds to the context, and it will actually also add to the Palace of Culture in a way, and that's why you can do it. But for example, if you just build housing there because you want to limit the space of the building, I would say, is it really the right answer? Is it that's almost a form of aggression, maybe, and that shouldn't be our way to deal with such buildings.
And I just had, as the two of you were talking, almost like a little flashback to a discussion which had been happening maybe some 10 years ago, and which had a similar topic. And the issue was essentially, what do you do with the large bunkers from the Second World War, which were built by the Nazis? They would be the bunkers you can find here in certain places in Berlin, like at the Humboldt-Hain. So you have got these huge monolithic sites, but you will also find them at the coast, for example, of France as part of the Atlantic Wall, or in also parts of Poland. So you are talking about very aggressive concrete Nazi architecture, and there had been a long debate, especially in the after the 90s, starting in the 90s, but then especially in the noughties, and saying the problem is that these bunkers often attract the wrong kind of people. In German, we call them bunker kissers, you know, militaristic people who get a certain buzz or who essentially convey the message. Oh, wow, this is a fantastic piece of architecture. It's very impressive. It's a technological masterpiece. So it's almost like an admiration of Nazi military architecture. And while they would do guided tours in many of these bunkers and say, oh, this is a technological masterwork, blah, blah, they would often forget, and the Germans would forget this, but also the people in the Netherlands or Poland, that these bunkers were often built by slave laborers. You know, it didn't fit in with their technology or concrete fascination. So there was a big debate whether it is actually a good thing or whether it would be a good thing to either demolish such bunkers or whatever. Some person even mentioned you paint them pink, because then all this, you know, bunker fascination would be gone and the militarists would be gone if their bunker was painted pink. But at the end of the day, I think the idea or the discussion then went into a different direction. So they would say, for example, in Saint-Nazaire in France, you have got this massive U-boat bunker, and maybe you could contradict the original message, like with the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, by having an international food market within the bunker. So you would, in a way, contradict Nazi ideology, this extreme nationalism, by having a multicultural food market and turning the whole thing onto its head, or really trying to, in inverted commas, break the fascination. So if you find the cultural palace oppressive, which I'm sure it is, and I've seen it with all the space around it, can you, you might say in a subversive way, break the fascination or break the aggression? Or can you, if that is perhaps problematic, at least, well, I'm now going to use an old-fashioned word, but it was very, you know, some 10 years ago, people would always use it. Can you deconstruct it? Can you, in a way, break the code, break the message, and tell people this is why we find it so oppressive, and how can we break this code, break the fascination, and, well, deconstruct it?
I think it's quite important not to ignore this post-totalitarian or colonization monument and memorial, because like they will continue to do what the regime was doing. And I quite impressed that all the time people trying to put this in the pink color, almost the same happened, not with this precisely tank from the Panzerdenkmal Kleinmachau, but with the snowball. So maybe it's also one more opportunity how we can work with the Soviet War Memorial. Just the small thoughts about this. Also quite important, I think, and like it's obvious that we started this discussion because of the full invasion of the Russian in Ukraine in 24th February. And my question to all our speakers, how changed the narrative about the Soviet architecture and the Soviet War Memorial after the full invasion of Russia in Ukraine after 24th February. So it's the question who are ready to speak first. Go ahead. Yuliya.
Okay, we can start with me. I think that maybe I will draw to this question that, or remark that all these architecture and monuments are the results of their own times, right? And also emphasize that each context is in a way unique, because as I see it now, it's very interesting with this Verträge, as you said, about these agreements to pass for, right? And I just read in Latvia, they also had some kind of agreement that Russian monuments shouldn't couldn't be touched or removed or whatever. And just after the Russian full-fledged invasion into Ukraine, they several weeks ago, as far as I understood, changed this clause in the constitution. So now they can remove the Soviets' monuments. And of course, the war changes a lot. And in Ukraine, it was already for many years the history, heritage, memory was the issue of security, and we spoke a lot about the securitization of the past, securitization of history, and we can speak about securitization of heritage, where the past is perceived and presented as a matter of security, of national security. So it also changes a lot the local context and the responses from the context we are in, right? But what I wanted maybe to emphasize, because I really felt resonance what Aleksandra said about this preservation and reconceptualization of totalitarian, Stalinist, and even later Soviet architecture and monuments. It was also in place in Ukraine, and especially after 2014, a lot of activists, they spoke about, and scholars spoke about this modernist project. And I just wanted to show this beautiful book. It's about the Soviet mosaics. It's just the art in itself. This book, it's very beautiful, and it's one part, like minuscule part of this reconceptualization and rethinking project, I think. And I think that it's still continues even during the war. What is happening, of course, a lot is now happening around the monuments. It's not so much architecture, I would say, but it's about the monuments to, for instance, Soviet monument to Ukrainian-Russian friendship, for instance. It was a huge monument in Kiev, and it was demolished. Because it was questioned what kind of friendship when the city is bombed by the Russian airplanes. This is, of course, the war, what the war is kind of influencing. But also, I, as historian, for me, it's very difficult to speak about these 2 months because I tend to see like everything in perspective. And during all these years of Ukrainian independence, I can see like a lot of trends, or several trends, which are still continuing. And this is exactly this preservation. For instance, this example of Soviet mosaics is this part of preservation. Then it's also decolonization, so that this Soviet monumentality becomes like a normal thing. It's not this canonical thing. It's a process of decolonization, and it also this decolonization of the Soviet historical master narrative, for instance. So that if you start questioning this canon, you can see a more complex picture of the past. And then what is also connected to decolonization is the reclamation process. And this is something what is used in this post-colonial studies to say that the group of the people or the nation, people are making something their own. And this is exactly this process of reclaiming the past. And this is, I think, that this film, when the tractors are pulling these Soviet tanks from Berlin. It's this kind of reclamation. We reclaim our past, as you said, that they were made in Kharkiv. We are pulling them back to Kharkiv. So this is a very good illustration of this reclamation. And again, there are lots of very playful reinterpretation when you have, like, for instance, Motherland Statue, this very monumental art. I really like this Motherland Statue in Kiev. And then you put some flowers on this statue to make it more a kind of modern, more up-to-date, and conveying some Ukrainian sentiments. And then, of course, there are lots of negligence, and very often this negligence, it ends up in demolition. And it's exactly when we come back to these mosaics, very often they were in the places of a very small kind of purposes, like bus stations. And they were just demolished by time, by people without who didn't know that it was something nice, beautiful, and modernist, for which these activists who are now struggling to preserve these mosaics are just really fighting for. But the people who destroyed a lot of these mosaics, they did it not with some kind of ideological purposes. They did it just out of ignorance. So this is also something what is going on. Yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you can hear me. I will make it short. Personally, I think that it's too early to make a generalization if something changed during these 2 months according to revalorization of socialist heritage. And as I told before, this is the complex phenomena, this is the complex architecture and historical heritage. So I don't think that this revalorization will take part. And it depends also who is asking and why is asking about the revalorization. We always get different questions when we ask different people about the architecture. Architecture is always the matter of politics. And in the end, I would say that some quotation from Dejan Sudic. Dejan Sudic, in one of the books, The Edifice Complex, asks what makes the building totalitarian or democratic? What makes the labels? The social political function, the detail, the column, the ornament, or the time of the realization? And the answer to the question, paradoxically, is not so obvious, because as it was a lot of times stressed here, we have a lot of layers of this architecture and a lot of perspectives. And I think that's all at this point, what I can say.
Then I would like to pass microphone to the Mateusz also.
So maybe we give the floor to our guests. So
I would basically agree with the previous statement. I think that at the moment we should leave the monuments as they are. I don't think there should be a knee-jerk reaction because, and I think this is one of the points which came across many times during this discussion, that these monuments need a lot of thinking about, and whether you want to build it or whether you want to change it or demolish it, I think the discussion needs a certain maturity, and I think the best thing to do in the meantime is something that you already saw here on the 8th of May, just basically 1.5 weeks ago, when there was something which you might call a little protest camp, maybe some 200 meters away from the Soviet monument here, so that you could have some information boards there, or you could have a wake to remind people permanently of what is happening in the Ukraine. So you have got something temporary there to challenge the monument, but without actually inflicting anything on its actual substance. So I think that would be perhaps the best thing to do for the time being.
The question was, what have we learned, or what has changed? I think we have learned something as maybe as German society, maybe as a global society, that we have to be very careful in the narratives of history, and we have always to look closer into them and see how people try to change them, and how have they been maybe also successful in the past, and that we need to re-evaluate. And this is something, as we mentioned, for example, also in terms of language, what is a Soviet monument, what is a Russian monument, and I think that's there's a growing awareness for that, and then there's also a growing awareness at the moment in my observance that the built heritage has a very dedicated role in for identification, and this is something we can obviously see in our discussion about the monuments here in Berlin, but it's also something we see by the destruction in Ukraine. And we all know that there has been deliberate destruction of Ukrainian heritage, and this is not just the destruction of buildings, but it's the destruction of identity. And I think there's, and I really do hope that there's a growing awareness of that, because it is a war crime, and yeah, I think that's maybe one of the processes which is taking place at the moment.
There will be agreement among the German political class to give those tanks from Tiergarten back to Kharkiv. Would you agree with it?
From a how should I say, from a, I have to agree if in terms of that I still have if the political level tells me I have to do something, I have to do it, but I would not agree in that this is the right way to do it from a scientific and a historian and the point of view from a conservator.
Then I will pass microphone back to you, Mateusz. How has changed this culture, the culture of remembrance after 24th February in this year?
I think that there's exactly what I said at the very beginning, that this Erinnerungskultur, this culture of remembrance, is open, and should be open for lively discussions, for intervention, so for people's engagement. And I think this heritage we are talking about is not something in concrete. I mean, not something which is stable for the whole future, next 200 or 300 or 400 years. I think there's something which is constantly negotiated. And I think some things which are, so Niko told us that something was unthinkable in Germany, or there was the divided memory between West and East Germans. I think there's that it could be, so of course, so 3 months is not enough to produce some changes, but I think we should, so to say, intervene more, and I think is necessity for here in Germany, so to incorporate the voices from Ukraine, the voices from Poland, the voices from other countries. I think there's also some regulatory examples, which was mentioned by Yuliya, so from Latvia. I said, but there's also on the political level or regulatory level, there are some new ideas and some new, so of course, in some countries, there are fast, or maybe some from some point of view too fast. But I think everything is open, and I think it could be also some small step approach, as with this example of space. If we, let's say, make the space of this monumental monuments a little bit not so broad, not that we limit, so to say, Treptower Park a little bit, and to put some new people, some new spaces, some new area or new area for action or for discussion or for reinterpretation of heritage. I think it would be good also for us for this international debate.
I will add from me that I will say that landscape, it's the quite alive definition, and it's changed by the change in the society, in the real events, and we cannot ignore this. And when we are trying to ignore this, it's happening the vandalism, which was with this Panzerdenkmal, Kleinmachau, I think, right? And I really like this definition, this quote by Aleksandra about the labels, but I would like to turn around it's in another way, that the type of the labels also describe someone, persons, or the community who are named them. And it's the same happening with the monument. When how we present this also tell a little bit more about us who present this monument. And that's why I think also quite important to not forget how the urbanists work with the landscape, in the term that they are also listening to the landscape, what the people who, and landscape could not exist without the people, without the society, and the same it's going to the society cannot exist without the landscape. And it's quite important to not forget to listen them, to give the dialogue, to also watch what's happening right now, because when we are taking the voice from them, we are making the same what was made by the totalitarian regime. And I think we are going to the end. We can open for the small moment for some thoughts or a question from the audience, if it exists any of that, or we can go to the private type of the connections and dialogues. Then I think that's all. I would like to thank to all our participants that they have had that they have found the time for this discussion, for the Mateusz, for the support for the Pilecki-Institut, for all of the Pilecki-Institut who support us, for the Vitsche, of course, who also have this support for this video and so on. And I do hope that it will not continue just with this discussion about this legacy of the Totalitarismus, and the architecture will continue to live together with the society and with the real events. Thank you so much.